The handcuffs felt like a promise. They were cold and absolute, digging iron into the delicate scent glands of my wrists. A crude reminder that the law cared nothing for the softness of an omega. I stood, listening to the judge's voice cut the air, a dry, indifferent sound that sealed my fate. 3 years. It was a calculation, not a punishment, a precise measure of time paid for the debt I'd incurred, and the debt I'd hoped to pay off. The $49,000 was gone, vanished like smoke from the barrel of my brother's desperation. I had accepted the job for $50,000. The remaining $1,000 was supposed to be mine, enough to disappear for a month. Now neither the money nor my freedom existed. All that remained was the hard reality of what I was. A smuggler, a fool, and a convicted felon, 25 years old and bound for federal concrete. I walked the receiving hall in a fog, the gray walls swallowing the faint light. My scent, normally subdued, felt amplified by my fear, a slick, sweet thing I tried uselessly to clamp down. Every alpha within 10 feet smelled the fear and the vulnerability. I kept my eyes fixed on the dirty floor. I did not want to be seen. I did not want to be counted. One day, I thought I would get out. My brother would be safe. I would find a way to make it right. Such promises were weak plaster against the massive, cold stones of the prison system, but they were all I had left. The medical examination room was sterile and harsh. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a migraine waiting to happen, casting everything in a flat, unforgiving white. The prison nurse, a thin beta woman with tired eyes, sat opposite me. She did her duty with the weary efficiency of someone who had seen too many failures. She drew blood. I watched the crimson fill the small vial, a necessary violation. She was checking for everything, pathogens, status, and the standard prison intake markers. I hadn't felt well, not for weeks. I had blamed the stress, the sleepless nights spent rehearsing the failed plan, the cold panic that had gripped me when the officers rushed in. She cleaned the needle mark on my arm and then turned back to her board, clipping the test results to a sheet. Her professional composure broke. Her hands went still. "Mr. Wesley," she began, her voice a hesitant, reedy sound. I waited, my breath shallow. Was it my markers? Was I sick? She adjusted the glasses on her nose, eyes fixed on the paper, avoiding mine. The silence stretched, thick and hot against the room's chilling air conditioning. "You're 4 weeks pregnant." The words did not sound real. They were clinical, flat, and entirely impossible. I stared back at her with wide, blue eyes unblinking. I tried to speak, but my throat was a desert. The blood test results were clipped there, the black ink a cold certainty. My cuffed hands, resting on the steel table, tightened until my knuckles were white and my wrists turned pale against the metal. Pregnant. Here. Now. The father. The realization slammed into me with the force of a concrete block dropping from a great height. It was the alpha. The prosecutor. Colin Sanders. The name flashed in my mind like a brand. 2 months ago, a drunken night, an expensive hotel room, a reckless desperation I had forgotten existed. He had left a faint trace of his powerful sandalwood scent on me, and I had foolishly washed it away, believing it was the last of him. I had never planned to see him again. The smug, controlled face of the lead prosecutor, who had argued for my maximum sentence, now belonged to the man who had knotted me, the source of the impossible life growing inside. This changed the arithmetic entirely. Survival was no longer just about enduring 3 years. It was about sustaining a life that was half mine, half his, and entirely vulnerable. "I want to see Prosecutor Sanders." My voice finally escaped, trembling and raw. It was a bluff, an absurdity, but it was the only move I could think to make. "I have the right to request legal counsel, don't I?" I watched the nurse. Her face was a study in pity and fear. She knew, I realized. She knew the kind of brutality that waited for a pregnant omega in this place. The fight for survival had already begun, long before I'd even heard the first slam of a cell door. 3 days later, the request for legal counsel was fulfilled. I was moved from the medical wing to a small, private visitor's booth, the room smelling of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. The stainless steel table gleamed under its own isolated spotlight, emphasizing the cuffs now linking my wrist to the chair. I waited, the knowledge of the life inside me burning like a dangerous secret. Every protective instinct I possessed had turned inward, focused entirely on the small, impossible warmth in my belly. The door opened, and the scent hit me first, a cold, sharp note of cedar and ambition, the unmistakable mark of a dominant alpha. It was not a lawyer. It was Colin Sanders. He He stepped into the booth, impeccably dressed in a suit that cost more than I had earned in 2 years, the very picture of clean, unyielding justice. He moved with the effortless authority of a man who commanded hundreds of thousands of dollars in annual salary, his presence a stark, cold contrast to the gray prison uniform I wore. He took the chair opposite me, his posture straight, his face a controlled mask of professional detachment. He did not look like a father. He looked like the man who had ordered my destruction. "Mr. Wesley," he said, his voice deep and measured, betraying no hint of recognition. His eyes, however, fixed on me with a calculating intensity that felt like a physical weight. "I am here regarding your request for counsel. As the lead prosecutor on your case, I should not be." "I know who you are," I interrupted. My voice was low, taut. I wanted to see the control crack. I wanted a flicker of recognition, some proof that the man who had touched me still existed behind the badge. He leaned back slightly, his scent tightening, a subtle flash of irritation or alarm. "Then you understand the conflict of interest this presents." "I understand nothing," I whispered, the rage finally warming the cold knot of fear in my chest. "I understand a single night of recklessness, and I understand 3 years of concrete. Tell me, prosecutor, does the federal system have a contingency plan for a pregnant Omega convicted on drug charges?" His eyes finally left my face and dropped, briefly, to the center of my uniform. It was the slightest movement, a mere twitch, but it was enough. The controlled detachment fractured. The realization, I knew, must have been immediate and sickening. The blood test report had surely found its way to his desk through some confidential chain of command. He knew. "That is a medical matter, Mr. Wesley, and entirely separate from the merits of your case," he stated, but the delivery was hollow. The scent of cedar was now underscored by a thin, bitter edge of panic. "Is it?" I challenged, leaning forward, the chain on my wrist scraping against the table. "You argued I was a blight on society, a necessary purge. Now you are the essential variable in my existence. I am carrying your child, Mr. Sanders. Does your sense of duty extend to defending the innocent life you created, or does justice only apply when the crime involves someone else's mistake?" The rhetorical question hung heavy between us. He rubbed his temple with 2 gloved fingers, a quick, precise motion that was the only visible sign of his internal storm. "I cannot act as your legal counsel. That would be illegal, unethical, and career-ending. But I can ensure you have the best counsel." He pulled a card from his expensive inner jacket pocket, placing it flat on the steel table. "Ms. Evelyn Reed. She is highly regarded. She will petition for protected status and reassessment. She will explore all available channels." I did not reach for the card. I just watched his face. The cold mask was firmly back in place, but beneath the discipline, I saw the terror of exposure. He wasn't acting out of affection. He was acting to protect his carefully constructed life, which I now threatened to demolish. "Do you know the price of a good lawyer, prosecutor?" I asked, a bitter smile touching my lips. "I only got involved in your world because I needed $50,000 to save my family. You think I can afford the best?" "The retainer is paid," he said simply, his voice returning to its default, indifferent tone. "Consider it a professional courtesy to an involved party. Use the card, Mr. Wesley. We will not speak of this visit again." He stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the concrete floor. He was retreating, putting the maximum possible distance between himself and the moral wreckage he had caused. As he walked toward the door, his shadow fell across the table, covering the lawyer's card in darkness. He was a force of law, and I was a simple Omega convicted of a crime. He had bought himself time, but he had not bought my silence. He had paid the retainer. The simple, cold transaction affirmed our relationship better than any spoken apology could have. The amount, though unstated, was certainly astronomical, a contrast that felt like a punch. I sat there, watching the door close, the silence rushing back in. I knew the lawyer he sent would be his eyes, his shield, and his attempt to manage the impossible truth of our connection. Ms. Reed arrived the following afternoon. She was efficient, cold, and expensive, exactly what Colin had paid for. She secured my immediate transfer to the protective custody wing, a concession bought with the prosecutor's hidden influence. It wasn't freedom, but it was a reprieve from the immediate, overwhelming danger of the general population. I was alone in a small, stale room, trading the threat of constant scrutiny for the crushing weight of isolation. The silence of the new unit felt false. It was a holding place for snitches, high-profile targets, and those deemed too fragile for the main house. I spent my hours tracing the hairline cracks in the concrete, wondering if the life I carried would ever see anything but gray. The child was silent, a tiny, demanding force that required me to eat the bland, tasteless food and breathe the circulated, recycled air. I had responsibilities now, duties far more pressing than the $50,000 I'd failed to earn. My routine became a chain: count, eat, walk the small, fenced-in yard. One day, I was walking the perimeter, clutching my thin jacket against the morning chill. The yard was a dreary square of cracked asphalt, surrounded by high chain-link fences topped with razor wire. I was focused on the ground, counting my steps, 120 paces across, 60 back, a small ritual of control. Then the air changed. It wasn't a sudden noise, but a shift in the density of the atmosphere, a drop in the temperature of the light. The usual low hum of the facility seemed to recede, replaced by a profound, heavy silence. Every beta guard and every low-ranking alpha nearby straightened, their movements becoming stiff and cautious. They were responding to a predator. I looked up. Across the yard, moving from the intake building toward the main block, was a procession of guards escorting a single, cuffed figure. He was tall, powerfully built, his custom-tailored suit replaced by the same ill-fitting prison fatigues I wore, though they seemed unable to diminish the sheer scale of his menace. His hair was dark, slicked back, and his eyes, even from this distance, held the sharp, unwavering focus of a man accustomed to absolute command. Dominic Carver. Dom. The man who had set the trap, who had promised me the money, and whose downfall had somehow delivered him right into my orbit. He moved with the practiced, predatory ease of an apex alpha, entirely unbowed by the chains on his wrists. He was a fortune in illegal narcotics, 1,000 lives ruined, a criminal empire reduced to a number tattooed on his arm. I watched him approach the main gate, his presence swallowing the light. Suddenly, his eyes flickered, moving quickly across the yard, past the guard towers, past the fences, until they stopped, locked directly on me. It was not recognition, at least not yet. It was the calculated look of an alpha assessing a variable, taking the measure of the only omega visible in the barren, concrete landscape. He knew I was the one who was supposed to have made the delivery. He knew I had failed. His expression was cold, utterly devoid of emotion, but I read the underlying current: betrayal. The air around me seemed to compress, filled with the raw, metallic scent of his contained fury. He believed I had failed him, or worse, that I had been the weak link that allowed his capture. The guards moved him quickly through the gate, and he was gone, swallowed by the massive steel door. I sank onto the nearest bench, the cold of the metal seeping through the thin fabric of my trousers. He was here. Colin was outside, attempting to manage his mistake from a distance with checkbooks and lawyers. Dominic was inside, an immediate volatile danger who operated not by law, but by retribution. The triangle was complete. Law, chaos, and the innocent life caught between them. I was a bird caged between two equally lethal hunters. The truth was simple. I was less safe in protective custody knowing that Alpha was breathing the same air. I put a hand to my stomach, a slow, protective gesture. If Dominic's focus shifted from his own imprisonment to the score I had ruined, my life, and the child's, would become incredibly short. How much was my failure worth to a man who controlled millions? I knew the answer. Less than the cost of a single used bullet. Protective custody was a lie told to the vulnerable. It was not safety, it was confinement under slightly better lighting. My small room was designed to keep the world out, but it also kept me in, a perfect vacuum for my mounting anxiety. The days bled into one another, marked only by the bland, repetitive meals and the distant, muffled sounds of the prison outside my steel door. I felt the physical changes now, a persistent nausea, the tightness of my uniform across my middle. Signs that the life inside was asserting its undeniable claim. I was an omega in a structure built for alpha dominance. My pregnancy, despite the private medical records, felt like a visible weakness. It made me a target, not because of what I had done, but because of what I was. The guards, mostly betas, treated me with a mixture of pity and contempt. They saw the complication, the problem that needed managing, and they smelled the fear that I tried to hold captive in my lungs. The protection Colin had purchased was thin. It cost him a retainer that was likely more than the value of the drugs I was caught with, a heavy price for a little temporary peace. But money could not buy silence among inmates. Information moved like a fever through the air vents. I knew they knew. One afternoon, during the brief, mandated recreation period in the small yard, I felt the shift. Two alphas, large and taciturn, who were supposedly housed in the protective wing for their own safety, drifted toward my corner. They weren't moving with hostility, but with purpose. They were observing the Omega, the one who smelled of sandalwood and expensive guilt. "Wesley," one of them rumbled, his voice rough and low. "Heard you've got a little souvenir." I did not look up. I continued to walk, counting my steps, pretending they were merely part of the cold concrete. Ignoring them was an old habit of self-preservation, but here, it was an invitation. The second alpha stepped directly into my path, forcing me to stop. He was close enough that his stale, dominant scent, an alpha I did not recognize, clamped down on my own, suffocating the natural sweetness of my Omega markers. "A prosecutor's mistake," the first alpha continued, a cruel smile splitting his face. "Bet that cost him a pretty penny. Everything has a price in here, doesn't it?" They wanted a reaction. They wanted to see the fear that matched my scent. I thought of the child. I had to be harder than the walls around me. "My price was paid in full," I said, my voice barely a whisper but steady. I met the man's eyes. "Yours is still accruing." It was a cold, foolish challenge, but it bought me 2 seconds. The alpha's smile vanished, replaced by a momentary, confused rage. Before he could escalate, the movement stopped. A guard had appeared at the yard gate, but he wasn't looking at me. His gaze was fixed on the far wall. The threat dissipated, not because of the guard, but because of a deeper, unspoken understanding. The two alphas turned abruptly and walked away, their purpose draining from their movements. I looked toward the main block. No one was visible, but I felt the weight of another alpha's observation. I knew whose power they had suddenly respected. They were afraid of Dominic, not me. He was the force of chaos they understood. His silent authority had purchased my momentary reprieve, a terrifying transaction I had not asked for. The true threat was not the inmates who wanted to harm me, but the men who believed they owned my survival. Later that week, Ms. Reed, my highly paid emissary, visited. She spoke of motions and pleas, using words that cost thousands of dollars apiece. She secured safer accommodation within the wing, a minor victory. "Your situation is unusual, Mr. Wesley," she said, folding her leather briefcase shut. "The prosecutor is taking a personal interest in your welfare. He has authorized all necessary medical expenses." All necessary medical expenses. The casual mention of an unlimited fund felt obscene. Colin was paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to defend a life he'd endangered. It was a cold, monetary proxy for a conscience he couldn't afford to show. I did not thank her. The money was not a gift. It was a cage plated in gold. Colin came back. Not as a prosecutor, but as a visitor, a man with a suit and a secret. They met in the same sterile booth, the glass between us reflecting the harsh lights. He smelled less of cedar now, more of contained anxiety and the dry paper of legal documents. His visits were infrequent, arranged with meticulous caution, always under the guise of consulting with outside counsel. He never touched the handcuffs linking my wrist to the chair. He looked only at my face, avoiding the growing curve of my abdomen, a silent acknowledgement of the reality he was paying so much to ignore. This pretense of professionalism was the only way he knew how to manage his guilt, a guilt that must have felt like a weight of gold pressed onto his ambition. "Ms. Reed has filed the motion for compassionate release," he stated one afternoon, his voice low, a monotone. "Given your medical status, there is precedent. We are optimistic about a reduced sentence." I watched him, cold and unmoving. "Optimistic means nothing in here. It means only that you will try to buy my way out before this complication becomes public." He didn't deny it. He never denied the core truth of our transactional relationship. "I am fulfilling my duty," he responded, his jaw tight. "Duty," I repeated, the word tasting like rust. "Was it duty that made you blind drunk that night in the Beaumont? Did duty tell you to find the nearest Omega, to release that ruthless heat? Or was that just simple, predatory desire, something you thought the money and your badge would cleanse?" The attack landed. His control wavered. A deep, unpleasant flush spread across his pale cheeks. He was accustomed to prosecuting the morally bankrupt, not being confronted by the object of his own moral lapse. "I regret the circumstances," he managed, the phrase formal and hollow. "Circumstances?" I scoffed. "Circumstances are the lack of $50,000 that put me in here. This," I gestured to my body, "is consequence. And it's your consequence, too." I leaned in, meeting his gaze fully. When I saw your face in the courtroom, I knew I was truly lost. I was the dirt you scrubbed off the city sidewalks, and you were the law that wielded the brush. Now, we are bound by something stronger than any legal document you've ever signed. The rhetoric was harsh, unvarnished, but it was the truth. It was the only currency I possessed. He closed his eyes for a short, agonizing moment. When he opened them, the coldness was still there, but it was mixed with a weariness I hadn't seen before. I have transferred a significant sum to a secured account, he said, shifting the subject back to the only thing he could control. It is enough to establish a life for you and the child outside of this state. You will not want for anything. It is a debt I am willing to bear. I knew the amount would be astronomical, probably 6 figures, a terrifying mountain of money that made my initial $50,000 seem like pocket change. He was buying peace of mind, trying to pay his way back into a clean conscience. I hated the money, but I knew the child would need it. This was the cold, capitalist reality of our pairing, a contract signed in blood and shame. Debt is a chain, prosecutor, I told him, picking up the dry legal papers he'd brought. You think you're buying us freedom, but you're just extending the chain to your own ankle. You will not be free until the child is. He left shortly after, his usual stiff retreat accelerated by my final words. He was torn between the duty of his profession and the sudden, inconvenient duty of fatherhood. I watched the door close. He believed money could solve this. I knew better. Only truth, and the strange, watchful presence of Dominic Carver, would decide our fate. My life settled into a rhythm of anxious waiting. I was 5 months pregnant. The movement was a constant, subtle fluttering, a reminder that the world had not stopped for my incarceration. Colin's checks continued, his money buying silence outside and minimal comfort within, but the true dynamic of my survival was shifting, pivoting away from the law and toward the chaos. Dominic Carver was a ghost. I never saw him up close after his intake, but his presence was a constant, heavy shadow over the facility. He was in the maximum security block now, running his operation from the core of the prison, yet the ripple effects reached even my isolated wing. I felt him through the subtle deference of the guards, the quick, averted eyes of other inmates, and the strange, sudden breaks in my own isolation. The 2 alphas who had accosted me in the yard never returned. Their unit was transferred shortly after their attempt. It was too fast, too efficient, for prison administration. That kind of immediate, precise removal spoke of power, not procedure. It spoke of a debt being settled by someone I owed nothing to. I began to watch the periphery during my yard time. I never saw Dominic, but I saw the men who worked for him. They were distinct, harder, quieter, their eyes carrying the cold authority of their boss. One day, I was alone in the library cubicle, reading a discarded, musty copy of a legal thriller. I had placed my water bottle on the floor, the metal vibrating slightly against the concrete. When I reached for it, my cuffed wrist knocked the bottle over. The water spread quickly across the worn linoleum, flowing toward the stack of legal documents Ms. Reed had left for me. Documents that cost thousands of dollars and held my fate. I struggled with the chain, trying to shield the papers with my body, the cuffs preventing any quick action. Suddenly, a massive boot stepped into the widening pool of water. It was an alpha, one of Dominic's known associates, a man built like a wall, smelling strongly of stale tobacco and sheer size. He stood over the spreading water, his presence a dark, immediate threat. I braced myself. I expected a sneer, a threat, perhaps the final, deliberate ruin of my documents. He did not look at me. His gaze was fixed on the spill. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion that spoke of practiced economy, he nudged the water bottle with the tip of his boot, directing the flow away from the stack of papers. Then he turned and walked out, vanishing into the maze of shelves without a sound. I stared at the papers, dry and safe, and then at the spot where the alpha had stood. It was an act of non-hostility, a small, quiet intervention that cost him nothing but provided me with everything. It was the moment I realized I was being protected. Not by the badge, not by the law, and certainly not by the thousands of dollars Colin was pouring into my defense. I was being protected by the alpha I had betrayed. The realization was a heavy, complicated burden. Dominic Carver had every reason to demand my suffering, to see me punished for his own arrest. Yet, he was expending his own internal capital to secure my tenuous safety. Why? Did he feel remorse? Was he protecting the child, the innocent complication he perhaps hadn't anticipated? Or was I just a chess piece in a larger game, valuable only because of the powerful alpha tied to my pregnancy? 6 months. The child was no longer a flutter, but a persistent, undeniable weight. My movements were slow now, cautious. My omega scent, once fearful, was now overlaid with the heavy, calming pheromones of late-term gestation, a biological shield that bought me a small measure of quiet respect in the volatile concrete landscape. The thousands of dollars Colin was spending were now almost entirely dedicated to medical care and ensuring the food trays were not poisoned. Ms. Reed had secured a significant delay in my motion for release, a strategic failure that served a larger purpose. She visited, her expensive leather briefcase always containing far more than legal texts. This time, she left a carefully edited file, buried deep within a stack of procedural documents, almost hidden from view. I spent the next 2 nights reading it by the weak glow of the cell light, the cold steel of the chair pressing into my spine. The document was a summary of the police sting that led to my arrest, marked internal use only. It contained surveillance logs, transaction times, and detailed records of the informant who had tipped off the federal agents. The name on the file was not one I knew, but the details were damning. The informant was someone deep within Dominic's organization, someone with access to the exact time and location of my delivery. I hadn't been caught through bad luck or my own incompetence. I had been set up. The entire operation, my job, my brother's debt, the promise of the $50,000, had been orchestrated by a double agent who planned to take down Dominic and collect their own substantial reward. I was just the expendable delivery omega. The betrayal was immediate and searing. The world was not random. It was simply cruel and meticulously planned. I was not a smuggler who failed. I was a pawn sacrificed on a massive, highly paid chessboard. The next time Colin came, the pretense of the legal consultation felt paper-thin. He looked exhausted, his alpha composure strained. His expensive suit hung heavy on his frame. "Your lawyer is making headway on the corruption angle," he murmured, avoiding my gaze as he reviewed a file. "There are discrepancies in the official arrest reports surrounding the Carver bust. Massive sums of unexplained money have moved through the accounts of several high-ranking officers and even some prison officials." "The money always moves," I said, my voice flat. "I know how I was caught, Colin. I read the logs. Someone inside Dominic's crew sold me out, and they sold him out, too. This wasn't a clean bust. It was a palace coup." He looked up then, the recognition stark in his eyes. He had known, I realized, but he had waited for me to confirm the terrible truth. "That complicates things," he conceded, tapping his pen against the file. "The conspiracy is larger than a single drug charge. It runs deep into this very facility. If Dominic Carver cooperates, the entire network collapses. But getting a criminal of his stature to trust the justice system—" "He's already protecting me," I interrupted. The admission was strange, dangerous, but necessary. "His people keep the others away. He knows I'm carrying your child. He is balancing chaos with some twisted form of honor." Colin's scent spiked, a sharp, almost painful scent of conflicted fear and possessiveness. The idea of Dominic, the ruthless outlaw, acting as my silent guardian must have been an unbearable affront to the prosecutor's sense of order. "I will arrange a meeting," Colin decided, the decision abrupt, weighted with risk. "Not with you, but with him. Under maximum security, no recording. If he is protecting you, he has a moral axis, however skewed. We need him to see that exposure is the only path to your safety, and perhaps his own redemption." It was a terrifying proposal. The alpha of law and the alpha of chaos joining forces, their only common ground the innocent life inside me. I was the bridge, the necessary point of contact between two men who embodied everything opposite in the world. This was no longer just about survival. It was about tearing down a corrupt system built on lies and massive financial transactions. I agreed with a slow nod, my cuffed wrist heavy. "Tell him the truth. Tell him I know who betrayed us both." I was 7 months pregnant. My body was heavy, slow, and my omega scent was rich with the near-paternal need for calm and security. It was the scent of life demanding protection. Colin had secured the meeting with Dominic. The wheels of law and chaos were turning, slowly grinding toward the shared goal of exposure. But corruption moved faster than justice. One evening, I was shuffling back from the medical examination room, a long walk that took me through the least trafficked corridor of the protective wing. The corridor was cold concrete and weak, flickering bulbs. I heard the scrape of cheap rubber soles behind me. I had time only for a quick surge of fear before two large shadows converged. They were not Dominic's men. They were strangers, hard-faced alphas with the unmistakable odor of cheap institutional soap and controlled violence. They had been paid. The amount, I thought, was probably paltry, a few $100s and the promise of a lighter sentence, but enough to buy the silence of an expendable Omega. "A pity about the kid," the first alpha grunted, his hand reaching for my throat. "The boss wants quiet." I instinctively folded myself over the child, a shield of flesh and fear. The rough fabric of their uniform scraped against my cheek. I tried to scream, but the air caught in my lungs, trapped by the sudden, crushing pressure. This was the moment the protective custody failed, the moment Colin's thousands of dollars were proven insufficient. Suddenly, the cold air was filled with a furious, overwhelming alpha scent. It was sharp, demanding, the terrifying, uncontained pheromones of an alpha ready to kill. It was Dominic. He appeared from the dark recess of a maintenance closet, moving with brutal speed. He did not speak. He did not issue a warning. His actions were a pure, violent reaction to a threat against something he had claimed. A sickening sound, the crack of bone against concrete, was followed by a gasp as Dominic's fist connected with the first alpha's jaw. The alpha dropped instantly. The second man, seeing the sheer, unrestrained fury in Dominic's eyes. Dominic did not hesitate. He was a terrifying machine of self-preservation and rage. The two hired thugs were down, bleeding, broken. Dominic stood over them, panting, his powerful chest heaving. The wound on his arm was deep, bleeding freely onto the dirty concrete floor. He looked at me then. His eyes, usually cold, were burning with a kind of fierce, protective fire. He was an outlaw, a killer, a man who dealt in betrayal and drugs, yet he had thrown himself into violence to protect the child of his prosecutor. The act was massive, disproportionate to the small, pathetic life I had. The money, it wasn't enough, he managed, his voice a strained rasp, referring not to the hundreds of thousands Colin had spent, but to the paltry bribe the hired men had accepted. They wanted you quiet. The noise had drawn a guard. The panicked whistle cut the air. "Carver. Wesley. What the hell happened here?" Dominic didn't answer. He slumped against the wall, his powerful shoulders shaking. Moments later, the chaos escalated. I heard the frantic, organized clamor of a crisis situation. Then a sharp, familiar alpha scent cut through the terror Colin. He strode into the corridor, pushing past the low-ranking guards, his face pale with a mix of fury and fear. "I am Prosecutor Sanders. This is now a scene tied to the ongoing corruption investigation. Wesley requires immediate transfer to the prison hospital. Secure Carver." Colin's voice was pure, unyielding law, and for once, the law was on my side. He knelt beside me, his hands hovering. "Are you hurt, Elliot?" "The child is safe," I whispered, looking past him to where Dominic was being cuffed, his injured arm bleeding relentlessly. "He saved us." Colin followed my gaze, his lips thinning into a hard, complicated line. He had paid for protection, but the true cost was borne by the man he was trying to put away forever. The prison hospital was cold and smelled of iodine and stale despair. I was monitored, the doctors assuring me the child was safe, shielded by the alpha's reckless intervention. Dominic was in the adjacent ward, recovering from the deep cut and blunt force trauma. Colin had orchestrated this, using the attack as the final, public lever to prove the deep corruption within the facility. The system was now forced to cannibalize itself. Colin visited me first, his demeanor shifting from the cold prosecutor to the anxious father. He talked less about law and more about the future, about a small house far from the city. He no longer spoke of his duty to the badge, but his duty to the life I carried. He had already resigned, he admitted, signing away $250,000 in annual salary and benefits to open his own small firm. The contrast was stark. He traded a fortune for a fragile moral clarity. "I spoke with Carver," Colin said, running a tired hand over his face. "He's agreed to cooperate. Full disclosure on the operation, the payoffs, the betrayal, everything. It's enough to bring down the whole structure, including the informant who set us up." "What did you offer him?" I asked, my voice weak. I already knew the price was not monetary. "Leniency," Colin replied, his voice firm. "A substantial reduction in sentence for his cooperation. But the real exchange wasn't legal. It was about you. He said he wouldn't talk unless he knew the child and you would walk free. He didn't ask for $1. Only for certainty." I closed my eyes. The outlaw had sacrificed his only bargaining chip, his silence, for my safety. This was the moral center of the chaos, a terrible kind of honor. After Colin left, an orderly, clearly paid, wheeled me to Dominic's bedside. He was pale, stitches tight across his forearm. His powerful alpha scent was muted, overwhelmed by the sickly sweet smell of antiseptics. "You should be resting, Wesley," he rasped, his voice rough. "You shouldn't have done that," I replied, ignoring the pain in my own back. "You risked everything for nothing." He looked at me, his eyes holding the cold intensity one remembered from the yard, but now mixed with a deep, private weariness. "I didn't risk it for nothing. I risked it for the truth. The system that put me here, that turned its back on my own family years ago, is rotten. The man who betrayed me, who used you, he deserves justice. But you? You were just the debt I tried to settle." He paused, a flicker of genuine remorse crossing his face. "I apologize. For the $50,000 lie, for the ruin I brought you. I saw what happened to me happen to you. I saw the look of a man trapped by something bigger than himself. You did what you thought you had to do for your family. That means something." He was confessing, not to the prosecutor, but to the Omega who carried his enemy's child. I looked at his injured arm, the painful, tangible scar of his redemption. The trial was swift and brutal. I testified via closed circuit, 7 months pregnant and visibly shaken, but clear in my account. The jury saw the Omega, trapped, manipulated by Dominic's organization and betrayed by the corrupt network. The evidence Dominic provided was irrefutable. The high-ranking officers were indicted. The informant was exposed. Elliot Wesley was offered a plea deal, time served, early release, and probation under protective custody. 6 months after my initial sentencing, I walked out of the federal prison gate. The cold air hit my face, clean and sharp, a sensation I had forgotten. I was 7 months pregnant, carrying the Alpha prosecutor's child, and saved by the Alpha drug lord. Freedom felt precarious, heavy with unspoken debts, and the knowledge that the world was rarely fair, only transactional. Colin was waiting outside the gate, no longer in a suit, but a simple wool coat. He looked older, tired, but his eyes were fixed on me with a quiet, undeniable love. He was the only future I had left. The air outside tasted like redemption, but it was thin, conditional. My freedom was paid for by the loss of Colin's career and Dominic's long incarceration. It was a heavy currency, one I carried every day. Colin had purchased a small, quiet place hours away from the city, far from the cold reach of federal concrete. He had traded his law practice for a small firm focused on defending the wrongly accused, a direct rebuttal of the man he used to be. The contrast was evident in his hands, which now worried over the temperature of the house instead of the language of a brief. 3 weeks after my release, the child arrived. The delivery room was full of sterile light, but this time it was a light of creation, not judgment. Colin was there, not in a suit, but in hospital scrubs that looked entirely unnatural on his tall, controlled frame. His scent, cedar and now overwhelming fear, filled the space. He watched the birth with a raw, unprotected intensity that shattered the last vestiges of the cold prosecutor. When they placed the wet, squalling Omega infant on my chest, a small, perfect alpha male, I finally understood the price of life. It was worth every sacrifice made by the 2 men who had fought over me. Colin reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the baby's tiny forehead. "He's perfect," Colin whispered, the words thick with the emotion he had held captive for decades. A week later, the debt required a final acknowledgement. I drove the long distance back to the prison alone, Colin staying behind with the child. I left the car in the visitor's lot, the key in my pocket feeling heavier than the cuffs I'd worn for months. I needed to finish the cycle. I needed to close the transaction of my freedom with the man who had truly earned it. I found Dominic in the visitor's room. No glass barrier this time. His leniency had bought him contact visits. He was wearing the drab uniform, the scars on his forearms still pink and fresh. He looked older, quieter, the chaos drained from him, replaced by a resigned stillness. He was starting a 5-year sentence, the reduced consequence of his cooperation. I sat opposite him. I didn't speak of the trial, or the money, or Colin. I only spoke of the child. "He's a beautiful boy," I told him simply. Dominic nodded, his eyes fixed on my face, searching for truth. "I brought something," I said, reaching into the plain canvas bag beside me. I lifted the baby and held him up, close to the edge of the steel table. Dominic inhaled sharply, his hand stopping halfway across the table. He couldn't reach the child, but he could see him, a tiny, squirming bundle wrapped in white wool, smelling of milk and innocence. The alpha's eyes were locked on the infant's face, a fierce, silent intensity radiating from him. He did not ask to hold him. He simply observed the life he had saved. After a long silence, Dominic looked up at me, his gaze cold yet strangely clear. "Thank you," he said, his voice low gravelly, "for not giving up." It was the final acceptance, the quiet moral of the entire brutal story. Betrayal had led to incarceration, which led to love, which led to sacrifice. I left Dominic there, alone with his quiet truth and his cold, 5-year chain. I walked out of the prison and into the weak afternoon light, carrying the only thing that truly mattered, the warm, heavy weight of the future. The debt of the $50,000 was paid, not with cash, but with a life, an alpha's freedom, and the quiet, imperfect love that waited for me outside. I buckled the child safely into the car seat and started the engine. The world outside was still cold, but now it was full of light. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss our next video.